Sarah knew today would be a disaster before the alarm even screamed her awake. That was the trouble with hating your life. Every morning was a confirmation, a fresh stab of disappointment with a side of stale toast. She'd barely uttered a grumpy greeting to Mark and a half-hearted command to her indifferent teenagers before the fighting began. It started with the dishwasher. Sarah had a system. Whoever cooked didn't unload. Today it was Mark's turn, but he feigned cluelessness, eyes blinking owlishly behind his glasses. Huh? Isn't it, recycling day? The fight that followed wasn't even a real fight. Just the usual tired exchange of veiled insults and passive-aggressive sighing. But something in her snapped this time. Maybe it was the way Mark's normally slumped posture seemed to straighten, a tiny flicker of defiance in his eyes. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Weak," she hissed. "You're just a doormat. Everything falls on me." She hated the words instantly. They hung rancid in the air between them. His face hardened. "If you think I'm so weak," he said, voice low and laced with unexpected steel, "why don't you watch me be strong? Watch me let you have what you really want." He trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid, but the echo of it lingered, heavy as a threat. The rest of her day spiraled by in a blur of work, numbingly familiar, the sting of their morning quarrel fading into a dull throb behind her eyes. But Mark's words slithered back in the quiet of the evening. Did he mean it as a threat? Or was it insinuating something else, something buried under years of unspoken longing and frustration? A strange mixture of guilt and anticipation fluttered in her chest. Later, driven by restlessness and a stubborn flicker of defiance, Sarah found herself staring at her laptop screen. She opened a tab she usually avoided, fingers shaking slightly as she navigated to an online forum she knew existed but never dared to visit. It was a forum buzzing with whispers of desire seldom confessed, a place where couples explored the fringes of their comfort zones. Using a hastily created throwaway account, she typed with frantic fingers, "I want more. I want fire. But where do I even find that?" The response came within the hour, a direct message glowing softly on the screen. "You will, and then some." The username sent a shiver down her spine. "Masterful. Tell me how," she typed back, surprised by her own boldness. The reply came back a heartbeat later. "All power is a shared experience. There's a dance to it." Something about his words, the veiled confidence, ignited a long-dormant yearning. It felt thrilling, reckless, and she knew, deeply, undeniably dangerous. Sarah clicked off her computer, the rhythmic hum of the dishwasher the only sound in the house. The ending of this chapter would be written far beyond their little kitchen battleground. Had she just opened a Pandora's box, or was this the jolt of excitement she'd been so desperately craving? The not knowing both terrified and exhilarated her, and she had an eerie suspicion that her life was never going to be quite the same again. The end of this chapter would find Sarah a different woman from the one who'd started. The bored housewife, the disgruntled mother, she was still there, but buried beneath something new. Power, or the promise of it, thrummed in her veins. The consequences still a distant storm cloud on the horizon. "You'll look different, of course," Masterful instructed smoothly. "Something that makes you feel powerful, daring." Sarah studied her reflection, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The mousy brown hair was now a fiery red, cut into a sharp, asymmetrical bob. He'd sent the money for the salon and the new outfit, a scarlet dress tight enough to reveal every curve. A far cry from her usual jeans and sweaters. Their video calls intensified. Sarah found herself speaking thoughts she'd never dared voice aloud, playing roles, acting scenes of dominance and submission. Yet even behind the screen, those moments of vulnerability left her exposed. Masterful, his face always obscured in careful shadow, seemed to know her too well. It was as thrilling as it was unnerving. "One day soon we'll take this to the next level," he murmured, his voice a low rasp across the speakers. Sarah shuddered, unsure if the tremor was fear or anticipation. He spoke of meeting places, of hotel rooms, of turning her fantasies into reality. Something darker underlay those silken promises. A veiled challenge, a hint of control that set her teeth on edge. Meanwhile, a strange twist occurred in her real life. Mark's transformation was undeniable. His usual passivity was replaced by a quiet, almost unnerving confidence. Flowers left anonymously on the kitchen counter. Expensive chocolates tucked in her gym bag. The change in him sent tremors down Sarah's spine. Was this him sensing her restless energy, trying to win her back? Or was it a silent acknowledgement that he knew about her secret online world? That doubt festered until the day she accidentally stumbled on an open email on Mark's neglected laptop. Not an affair, that much was clear, but something equally clandestine. Company names she didn't recognize, discussions of untraceable offshore accounts, sums of money that made her gasp. It was the confirmation, the shocking illumination of another side of Mark. Not weak, far, far from it. Her husband wasn't the milquetoast man he'd pretended to be. Had his ominous words, "Watch me be strong," been a bizarre form of foreshadowing, a clue left for her amidst the hurt from their earlier fight? Had he known about her online rebellion, her flirtation with Masterful? Panic gnawed at her, twisting alongside a strange, forbidden thrill. Had her own double life exposed her to something far more dangerous? Mark, as it turned out, was a master of deception too. She'd accused him of weakness, of letting her walk all over him. Now the terrible possibility bloomed. What if he had been playing a long game, using her boredom and discontent? Sarah knew that from the moment she agreed to meet Masterful, the game was no longer hers to control. But this was not a twist she'd predicted. The ending of this chapter, well, neither she nor the reader would see it coming. The laptop became her nightly companion. Files scrolled through late into the night while Mark snored beside her, blissfully oblivious. Each detail she unearthed was another piece of a puzzle that made less and less sense. The shell companies, the coded emails, they pointed to something beyond the usual white-collar crime she'd first imagined. Had Mark stumbled into something darker? Something his meek persona had cleverly masked for years? "He seems distracted," Sarah mentioned casually to Mark over breakfast one morning, noting the telltale dark circles under his eyes, the way he nearly spilled his coffee. A flicker passed over his face. Guilt or calculated surprise at her newfound interest in his work life? The most unlikely lifeline came from yoga class. Sarah, a mousy woman with perpetually hunched shoulders and a worried frown, sidled up to her after a particularly grueling session. "You seem stressed," she'd said in that breathy voice. "Want to get coffee sometime? Sometimes it helps to talk." Surprisingly, it did. Amidst lattes and spilled secrets, Sarah found something invaluable. A perspective outside her own echo chamber of suspicion. "Those kinds of transactions, they're not just tax dodges, Sarah. My husband sees patterns like that at work. It's way shadier," Yoga Sarah confided, her eyes wide with concern. Her husband, it turned out, was an accountant, a man who lived and breathed spreadsheets. He'd noticed irregularities in a local company recently, something similar to the patterns of Mark's emails. Just the hint of a lead ignited a desperate energy within Sarah. The two women, driven by different motives, launched a clumsy investigation. Late-night calls, whispered conspiratorial coffee dates replaced yoga and PTA meetings. Sarah felt both exhilarated and terrified. The once mundane routines of her life suddenly spiced with clandestine meetings and coded conversations. Then came Masterful's demand. He was growing impatient for a real meeting, his tone shifting from playful to insistent. She wavered, a battle waging inside her. Fear, the sensible part of her, screamed to cut him off. Yet the recklessness that had taken root demanded to know the truth. She would meet him. A single encounter, strictly to see his face and hopefully glean some clue about Mark's tangled web of deceit. The bar he chose was dimly lit, almost anonymous. She arrived early, her pulse a frantic drumbeat beneath her carefully put-together facade. Each man who entered sent a frisson of panic through her. But it was the sight of the familiar figure who eventually walked through that door that truly turned her world upside down. Not some underworld criminal, not a stranger at all. It was someone utterly unexpected, someone who resided within her own life. That single reveal was the detonator, blowing apart the flimsy narrative she'd constructed. Her husband, quiet, passive Mark, had threads connecting him to her online seducer. Threads that spoke of a life lived in darkness right beside her own. Sarah wasn't sure if the world around her had truly spun off kilter, or if it was just the relentless pounding behind her eyes. It was the face. The face she recognized the instant shock wore off. That did the damage. That single moment blasted her life into a strange before and after duality. She'd never see that man the same way again, and the realization was both sickening and liberating. The confession to Yoga Sarah was meant to be a seeking of clarity. Instead, the clarity came from a completely unexpected source. "Mark?" Sarah echoed in disbelief as Sarah's usually soft gaze grew flinty. "You think your husband is this masterful character?" The question hung between them, heavy and accusation-laced. In her heart, Sarah knew it was preposterous. Mark, with his penchant for early nights and beige sweaters, he wasn't capable of playing such a cruel, dominating game. But her world was unhinged, logic thrown out like so much discarded wrapping paper. Every casual touch from Mark, every word he uttered was contaminated now with the ghost of his online persona. Was that a caress or a calculation? His sudden acts of thoughtfulness weren't romantic. They were twisted manipulations, weren't they? She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, just watched him, a silent, simmering accusation in her eyes. Yoga Sarah, sensing an opportunity, nudged her forward. Let's just follow him. Keep a distance, see where he goes. What harm could it do? Amateurish as it was, the surveillance was a balm to Sarah's frantic need for action. She'd tail Mark after dropping the kids off, slip away during lunch breaks with her new co-conspirator. Mark's routine was infuriatingly ordinary. Gym, office, grocery store, home. Yet there was that lingering sense, the certainty that the man she saw was merely the tip of the iceberg. His laptop became a minefield, every file scrutinized. She discovered cleverly hidden folders, transactions meticulously scrubbed, just vague enough to hint at something nefarious. You have to confront him, Sarah insisted, her usual timidity replaced with fierce determination. He's playing you, Sarah, playing you both. Now fueled by a mix of fear, betrayal, and a desperate need for truth, Sarah finally reached her breaking point. What is this? She hissed, shoving the printouts under Mark's nose as he got ready for bed. Who are you, really? Feigned confusion gave way to careful calculation in his eyes. It was just a flash, but enough to confirm his guilt. The fight that erupted was cathartic and horrific all at once. Words she'd only imagined spitting in Masterful's face were instead hurled at her husband. Mark countered with denials, then threats, then strangely with an appeal to twisted logic, an attempt to somehow justify his deception as empowering for her. The argument spiraled into absurdity, ending with her sobbing on the floor, feeling neither strong nor empowered, but small, foolish, and utterly lost. Sarah was trapped in her own personal horror movie, complete with a manipulative husband as the lead villain and a soundtrack of her own doubts echoing relentlessly. The end of this chapter would see her bruised, terrified, but finally waking up to the true danger she faced. Mark was coldly efficient. He never raised his voice now, just laid out his defense with a chillingly calm demeanor that cut deeper than any shouting match. You see shadows, Sarah, he chid. You're twisting innocent things. Perhaps you need help. A good therapist could sort out these delusions. Those words, delivered with a mix of pity and scorn, echoed in her skull during sleepless nights. Was this all just some bizarre breakdown on her part? The fiery redhead, the illicit video calls? Was she losing her grip on reality, fueled by a desire for drama her mundane life couldn't provide? Sarah, her usual meekness replaced by a desperate defiance, clung to Yoga Sarah as her one lifeline. He's gaslighting you, Sarah insisted when presented with Mark's twisted accusations. Ignore him. Just focus on the evidence. You have it. But the tension between the two women began to crackle under the pressure. Yoga Sarah's quiet life was upended by this intrigue. Her husband grew suspicious, her world off kilter. Sarah felt selfish, dragging this hesitant friend into her own self-created mess. Could she blame her if Sarah decided to cut ties and run? It all climaxed one rainy Thursday evening. Sarah, fueled by a gut instinct she couldn't quite explain, arrived home expecting an empty house. But Mark's car was in the driveway. Inside, she found him tearing apart their home office, searching frantically for something. His mask of calm completely shattered. He unleashed a chilling tirade when he saw her. You have to stop this, he snarled. Do you have any idea what you've stumbled into? This wasn't about playing the hurt husband anymore. It was something darker. His desperation ignited a cold fire in her. She would not be his victim. Words turned to shoves into an all-out struggle. Mark, always physically unimpressive, revealed a surprising strength, fueled by desperation. A crash, a scream, then darkness. When her vision cleared enough to make sense of her surroundings, she realized she was slumped against the wall, dizzy and disoriented. Above her, two men were grappling, Mark no longer the one in control. Easy now! A gruff voice she didn't recognize grunted as they subdued a thrashing, cursing Mark. The man turned towards her, his face scarred and hard. Was this just another layer of the nightmare? A new tormentor in her twisted game? His actions said otherwise, though. He carefully collected Sarah's scattered files, Mark's laptop, and even helped her into his unremarkable sedan. I owed you this, Sarah, he said quietly as they pulled away from the house. A long, long time ago. It turned out this stranger was a key from Sarah's own past, a man Mark had wronged years before. This was revenge playing out, and she was caught in the crossfire. Mark's world, as it turns out, was far darker than a few shady business deals. This was something vast, brutal, and she'd unknowingly ripped open its underbelly. Clarity came, not as a wave of relief, but as a cold knot of determination. No more games, no more fantasies. It was time to survive, and for survival, she needed the truth, no matter how dangerous. The seed planted by her mysterious savior had begun to sprout, a twisted, stubborn thing that took root in the barren soil of her shattered life. Fear was still there, a constant companion, but now it was edged with a steely determination. Sarah was done being a chess piece. It was time to take control of the board. And her first opponent? Mark. He'd underestimated her, and now she'd use his arrogance against him. Her new partner, the man known only as Cal, was an enigma. His weathered features and the network of scars on his knuckles spoke of a violent past. His motives were unclear, yet he held some grudge against Mark, some debt to be repaid. This wasn't about rescue, but about leverage, and Sarah was ruthlessly aware of her place as a pawn in their larger game. Each address he handed her became a stop on her own private investigation. Warehouses by the docks, seedy hotels on the city's fringes. The world she uncovered reeked of desperation and greed, a far cry from the sanitized spreadsheets and jargon of Mark's dealings. Men with hollow eyes handled boxes that hinted at horrors, not mere accounting discrepancies. Sarah's boredom, the discontent that had fueled her initial recklessness, was replaced by a chilling realization. She'd stumbled into a web of true human misery. She started to play her own dangerous game, dropping hints to Mark, leveraging the very real fear now in his eyes. Late-night untraceable texts alluding to discoveries he hadn't anticipated her making. Each panicked reaction from him was a data point, a piece of the puzzle. His world was unraveling, and she was the one tugging on the loose threads. It was terrifyingly liberating. Yoga Sarah, now reluctantly drawn deeper into this against her better judgment, became Sarah's confidant and accomplice. "You think they'll try and silence you?" Sarah asked one evening, her voice barely a whisper. The fear was real, yet so was the odd thrill. Could she face that possibility now? The answer came sooner than expected. A break-in at her house, nothing of value taken, just an overturned vase and a note scrawled on the kitchen counter. "Stop digging." The threat hung in the air, both terrifying and strangely empowering. If they saw her as a problem, then she was more than the bored housewife Mark had so easily dismissed. The line in the sand was drawn. Sarah would have to cross it, but she wasn't sure how far she was willing to go. Could she stoop to their level? Use the blackmail material she'd gathered on Mark? The knowledge of his illicit dealings? The proof of how he was funding their shadowy enterprise? Betrayal, she discovered, was an even more potent fuel than desire. Each decision, each risky move, painted her into a corner. There was no turning back to the woman she was. Sarah would likely never emerge from this unscathed, and the truth, when finally found, might destroy what was left of her life. Yet she barreled forward, driven by a relentless need for answers, and perhaps an even deeper need for retribution. Sarah knew how this story was supposed to end. But like everything in her new reality, the predictable endings had been cruelly torn away, leaving her grasping for any kind of control. The twist she hadn't bargained for, though, was that it wouldn't be her husband's destruction, but her own, that she had to prevent. Mark's meticulously crafted facade was crumbling, and it wasn't satisfying, just terrifying. The meek, bespectacled accountant was now a manic, sweating mess, his threats laced with panic. "You'll get us all killed!" he'd shrieked during one particularly nasty fight. "They know you're poking around, poking where you shouldn't." His control. Once her weapon against him was now a liability. He was a rat trapped in a corner, and that made him exponentially more dangerous. And just as he'd predicted, a new layer of fear descended. His people, the ones she caught glimpses of in dingy warehouses and overheard in hushed phone calls, were different. They weren't just pencil pushers in ill-fitting suits, but men with the look of true violence in their eyes. She was no longer a bored housewife to them, but a disruption in their operations. Then the sucker punch she never saw coming. "It'll be easier this way, Sarah," Yoga Sarah had stated, her soft eyes hardening into something Sarah didn't recognize. A crumpled envelope left on her doorstep revealed everything. Copies of their private conversations, their whispered plans, the photos, all marked up with red X's, an unsubtle confirmation of what was to come. The hunted had just become the primary target. The betrayal shattered the last vestiges of her old world. Now, there was no one, not even a frightened conspiracy theorist she could trust. Her world constricted to shadows, every car that slowed a little too long on her street, every stranger brushing past her, a potential threat, and yet she never felt more alive. Fear was her fuel now, keeping her sharp, forcing her to think like the criminals who pursued her. She reached out to Cal, that cryptic figure from her past. He wasn't a rescuer, she knew that, but he had a certain ruthlessness she now desperately needed. "You want to survive?" he'd grunted when she finally located his grimy, ever-shifting safe house. Learn to hide in plain sight. Her transformation was brutal. The mousy wife, the fiery seductress, all were shed like unwanted skins. She dyed her hair back to a forgettable brown, ditched her meticulously chosen outfits for thrift store anonymity, learned to observe from the corner of her eye. Her world shrank to grimy bus terminals, pay-as-you-go cell phones, and cash transactions that left no trail. She was a ghost in her own life. The glimpses of the network's inner workings turned her stomach. Warehouses that looked ordinary from the outside, but held the haunted eyes of trafficked women. Crates, their contents hinted at with sickening euphemisms. The enormity of it all was both crushing and galvanizing. If this was the enemy she was up against, playing fairly wasn't an option. Morality now existed in shades of gray. She had to steal, to lie, even forge documents to keep breathing. She'd once prided herself on being a decent person, but decency was a luxury in this brutal new world. Survival demanded she become something far less, and the question that haunted her wasn't if she could do it, but how much of herself would be left by the time she was done. Sarah was no longer a player in this game. She was the dealer. The trap, meticulously planned with Cal's help, felt as cruel as it was necessary. She'd dangle Mark, wounded and desperate, as bait for the sharks now circling him. They needed the information he held, the codes and passwords and connections that kept their vile machine running. Mark would promise them everything in a last-ditch attempt to save his own skin, and they would fall for it. The abandoned warehouse Cal had chosen as the setting felt grimly appropriate. Once a place of shadows and whispers, it would now be the stage for their final act. Sarah, hidden in a dusty storage loft, watched them arrive. Mark, a pathetic wreck of a man, and the faces she'd only seen in blurry photos. Men with eyes as cold as the steel they brought with them. "You set this up?" One of them growled at Mark, his voice barely containing a simmering violence. Sarah held her breath. Everything depended on Mark convincing them, on playing the part of hunted dog just convincingly enough. And then it went wrong. A flash of movement by a back entrance. A figure Sarah didn't recognize. One raised voice, a gunshot, and the carefully laid plan devolved into chaos. Screams, more shots, the warehouse now filled with the acrid stench of gunpowder. It was impossible to tell from her vantage point who had been hit or who was winning this fight she'd started. All Sarah knew was she was trapped, with the battle likely to spill up towards her soon enough. Panic warred with a strange sense of detachment. Was this what she had become? A woman for whom gunfire was the soundtrack to survival? Scrambling blindly across the loft, she found her escape route, a rusty ladder leading onto the roof. Mark was long forgotten. Her victory had morphed into a desperate fight for her own life. The end to Mark's story played out on that grimy rooftop. He lay crumpled beside the air conditioning unit, his eyes reflecting a mix of fear and surprise. Not at the betrayal by his wife that he must have expected, but at the identity of the man standing over him. Someone she knew, vaguely, from his circle. An unassuming face now twisted with a chilling satisfaction. Mark died without ever knowing the true puppet master he had served. The rest was a frantic blur. Escape aided again by Cal and his ever-changing vehicles. A safe house that was never truly safe. The constant sense of being tracked, followed, even in the quiet moments. But the network was fractured, its key players dead or scattered. She had achieved her goal, a Pyrrhic victory, leaving her tasting ashes, not the sweetness of vengeance she'd craved. Her nights were plagued by nightmares. Mark's accusing eyes, the hollow faces of trafficked women, the blood on her own hands. PTSD, Cal diagnosed with a casual shrug, happens to the best of us. The worst part, though, was the quiet moments when she'd stare at her own reflection, shocked by the coldness in her own eyes. Sarah didn't recognize the woman looking back at her. In the end, they did not meet for coffee again. She and the unlikely ally forged in the crucible of violence. They parted ways abruptly, a mutual understanding that their association was dangerous for them both. Sarah disappeared, a ghost leaving behind no forwarding address, no way to be found. The final scene isn't glamorous. It's a sparsely furnished apartment in a city she doesn't know, groceries purchased with cash, blinds permanently drawn. A text arrives from a number she doesn't recognize. "We're not done yet." It could be a threat, a reminder that the shadows were always there. Or maybe a twisted kind of invitation. This battle may be over, but the war, it seemed, wasn't. And a chilling part of Sarah was perversely drawn to the unknown, drawn to the danger.